things. So that's what we're up to.
Yeah, I don't think you're going to get that many. Oh, we won't talk to you because you talked to Malcolm and Simone.
Maybe they'll come
Hopefully
out of the
not.
woodwork. You may have more enemies than you think. Who
We'll
knows?
Oh,
see.
oh, we've got lots of enemies, but it's more like the trolling kind. I don't know if they
Yeah.
watch shows like this.
Yeah. Hey, listen, let me introduce you guys properly now that we're going live to YouTube. And then, of course, this goes out as a podcast, all sorts of places. So this is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and I am Frank Schaeffer, and my guests are Simone and Malcolm Collins. Simone and Malcolm Collins are entrepreneurs, authors of the best-selling The Pragmatist Guide series. And I read one of those books today, by the way.
Oh my gosh.
In
Cool.
full, and I have a lot of notes from it to talk to you about. And in that book, it referred to all the other ones on sexuality and all sorts of stuff. But I read the first volume. So,
Yeah.
okay, back to the introduction. Best-selling authors of the Pragmatist Guide series, covering life, relationships, sexuality, et cetera, and crafting religion, some of which you got into in the book I read, which we're going to talk about. They're advocates for pronatalism, education reform, and hard, effective altruism. And by the way, I just want to mention to both of you something to dip out of my thing here, that I've had a number of pronatalist writers that I've talked to very seriously. One I think you met, Catherine Pakuluk, who wrote
Yeah, we
Hannah's
love her.
Children. Catherine, and I actually, you can thank me for this, because I wrote to her and I said, "What do you think of um, you guys?" And she wrote back and said, "Well, I don't know much about them, but I kind of like them. They're very interesting people." And then later found out more about it and then reintroduced us. So Catherine's a friend. You're like the fourth guest we've had on because of her. Paul Morland, who's a British demographer,
Oh
um,
Yeah,
yeah.
we know
wrote a
him.
book
Yep.
called Tomorrow's People. Brad Wilcox, who wrote a book called Get Married.
Yeah, he's
Women
very, very
authors,
cool.
Boy, who wrote Boy Mom, and another one who wrote What Are
Mhm.
Children For?
Oh
So
yeah.
Simone and
Wow.
Malcolm, we have actually done a pronatalism series. We've had a lot of other things going on, but I have not only been talking to these people, but reading their books and very interested with it. And I want to give you just a little background on myself to set this discussion up. Um, I came at all this very differently than you all. I met Jeannie when we were 17 and 18, which is 55 years ago, and we had three kids. We would have had more, but she had a hysterectomy for medical reasons after our third. I have five grandchildren. I've been doing with Jeannie all the child care for the youngest three who live across the street, who are now 16, 14, and 10. And I mean, literally, they've never had a babysitter or anybody. Jeannie and I, she took an early retirement. And what
Damn.
we've been doing is caring for them. So when it comes to your pronatalism, um, I'm someone whose life revolves around various generations of children and intergenerational connection, which I think is a very important thing. So I just want to say that in terms of, your writing, um, I've been talking to people who have similar concerns to yours, similar concerns to me, because I'm very much on the same page with you on this. Um, so that's a sort of a disjointed introduction, but I want to get to the book itself that you wrote and make sure that I introduce this properly and then get into some things. It's called The Pragmatist Guide to Life, a guide to creating your own answers to life's biggest questions. I dug up something from one of your websites. The Pronatalist Foundation
Yeah.
is working to find a way for prosperity, gender equality, education, and technology to coexist with stable populations. Then it talks about your work in Korea, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, yeah.
Simon and Malcolm Collins have operated companies, and it talks about all the stuff you've done. And currently, you're building a new educational system designed to increase the quality and decrease the cost of gifted education. I want to talk about what that is. We are first pronatalists. We are the first pronatalist organization in the world, while a few have claimed partially similar motivation. They typically use pronatalism as an instrument to other ideological or religious ends. That's something I want to talk about. We take a strict non-denominational stance. Okay, so where I want to open this up is a little off the page, but it does come directly from your book. And that is, it ties in with my background because I had a pastor missionary family that I grew up in. You describe yourself as atheist Calvinist. And of course, those words leapt off the page to me. And I said, okay, if nothing else, we're going to talk about that. So who wants to dive in and tell me who your parents were where this comes from, and let's go there first
Okay,
because I'm
okay.
very
Before we go
interested.
further, I need to clarify because you have hinted you might have read one of two books. Did you read Life or Crafting Religion?
I read the first, let me just make sure I got the title right because you guys are so prolific. I've kind of could, I read The Pragmatist Guide to Life, a guide to creating
Okay,
your own
good.
answers
Yeah.
to life's biggest
That's the
question.
least crazy of our books. Okay, I'm glad that you read the least crazy of our books. No, our writing could be seen as very much almost sort of, if you're talking about like the ideological descendant of one of your children. My parents were very strict religious individuals. My parents they didn't fully rebel exactly, but they certainly weren't religious, and I wasn't raised within a religion. And then when I began to look around at the world, I realized that it appears, at least it's so far as I can see, impossible to motivate stable fertility rates alongside anything close to, gender equality or education or technological prosperity without what may as well be called religion. So yes, you could differentiate your culture in ways that, and some people would argue that our culture is differentiated in very secular ways, but they are so severe and extreme that to somebody of the dominant cultural group in our society, they would say it's a religious sort of splinter group. But I'd also point out that we also believe pretty strongly, we didn't believe this when we wrote our earlier books. This is like a new belief that we've had as we've gone back into the Bible, where I would argue that actually the Bible is the Christian Bible in the Old Testament is a materialist monist source, which would mean that it is in most people's mind arguing for a secular worldview. Specifically, if you look at passages like Ecclesiastes 3:18-22, and so. Yeah, I actually think that weirdly speaking, that the Bible and the Christian tradition, if read straight, could be taken to, but this gets way into other of our teachings, and I don't want to get like or our readings or like research, our track series, that I don't want to get too distracted with.
Well,
Simone, thoughts?
I understand that, but I want to also dip back with Simone here a second. Did you have anything in your background that gives me a clue to how we wind up calling ourselves um, Calvinist atheists or atheist Calvinists? Is that something to do with your background, or is that kind of an intellectual position you've come to as outlined by Malcolm at this point?
Both, because we would argue that humans evolved culture and religion alongside civilization. It was kind of
Sure.
software that runs on top of our hardware that makes it possible for us to live in complex societies where it just wouldn't work for us to really grok what's going on otherwise.
Yeah.
And our genetic backgrounds come from generations of people who were Calvinists, and before that, probably Catholics. So
Yeah.
I think there are selective pressures that are created by religions and cultural traditions, and that can shape people who are descendants of those cultures and religions. And as such, a lot of Calvinist and general Christian intuitions feel very natural to us when we actually explore them in depth. But the fact that we've come to our religion from a very first principles approach is more a product of, one, Malcolm just being a first principles person. There's nothing that he really takes for granted. It's just like, well, why would I do this? And then he just goes on from there. But both of us grew up in cultures in various ways somewhat devoid of a lot of religious tradition and devoid of strong religious faith. Especially me, I grew up in the Silicon Valley Bay Area in a very, very progressive society. My understanding of what a wedding looked like until maybe I was an older teen was people putting on masks in the woods and dancing around and doing naked sweat lodges and stuff. So like I just didn't have that background. I didn't read
What
the
town
Bible
did you
until
grow
high
up in?
school.
I'm just curious because I know the
In
area well.
Alameda, it's right across the
No,
bay
no,
from San
my
Francisco.
sister-in-law lives in Alameda, and my wife Jeannie will be flying out there as she does 2 or 3 times a year in a few weeks. So
Oh,
we're
that's so
totally on the
great.
same page. Hey, listen, I want to jump to something that's nothing to do with your book, but because we have a friend in common, um, in Pakaluk and her book, Hannah's Children. Catherine and I have had a lot of discussions, and she's read things I've written, and I've been reading her and also some of her lectures and so forth. She makes an interesting point in that book. Out of the 50 interviews that comprise the book with 50 women, all of whom have 5 or more children by choice, all of whom, with maybe a few exceptions, have PhDs. These are bright people who have decided to do this. I think Catherine told me that only one of them regards herself as completely secular. The rest, in some way, whether they're Catholics or Jews or whomever they may be, are religious. Now, Catherine and I have talked at some length about this, and she feels quite strongly not that the religion leads to pronatalism, but that it's not a coincidence that whether it's on the West Bank of Israel and the settlers there, or whether here interviewing Catholic and Jewish women who are fairly devout having more babies, that there is a connection in terms of the current pronatalist movement. And I think Paul Moreland would say the same thing about tomorrow's people, that when you take the specifically religious component out, you're left with people who are not as making the same choices. Now, you guys are very interesting to me because, as I said to Catherine, well, Simone and Malcolm seem to break that rule. Now you're talking about being atheist Calvinists, so there's a component there. But I don't think you're having many children in the same way that you feel that this is sort of the gift from God and that, why would you do anything else when this is the greatest thing you could do? And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think an interesting way to talk about you guys and your books and your teaching would be to look at some of the differences between you and your friend Catherine when it comes to this one thing. Because I'm very curious about that in terms of for two reasons. First, just an intellectual curiosity, but secondly, the long-term success of the movement that you're talking about, a pronatalist movement, people having more kids. Does it depend on churchgoers and Jews who are on the West Bank, people, very intentional communities, or is there a secular argument, genuinely a secular argument, for the points you're making in your work?
Well,
I'll leave you at.
So
Go
a
there
few
any way
points
you want.
here. One is I was just going to build on something Simone was saying in her last answer, which I think helps understand what she means when she talks about the heritability of religious traditions. There was a study that came out recently that showed that predestination specifically is a highly heritable belief, which I think shows, sort of what she's talking about there. But then to the question that you just asked, I think that this can be broken out in a few interesting ways. Historically, people might have more kids because more kids meant more money. It meant more people on the farm, more people to send to the factory, but now every kid you have typically decreases quality of life for a lot of people. Like after, let's say, 2 or 3 kids, like once you get above repopulation weight, really,
Sure.
not maybe you'll get something for kid 1, kid 2, 3, 4, the number you need to really for population to stay above repopulation rate. And so that means outside of increased personal quality of life, you need some exogenous motivation to have lots of kids. Now, that motivation could be logical, like I can say to an individual, if you value things like gender equality and the right to not have kids, then people who value those things need to be breeding above repopulation rate, or people who value those things won't exist in the future.
Right.
But this argument is completely unmotivating, it turns out, to like most secular individuals that we've engaged with.
That's not going to make anybody do anything.
No one's convinced by the logic. But what's also really interesting is I would argue that when I look at people like, Catherine Pockalock and some other people we know who are religious and have lots of kids, and I've noticed this especially with the Catholics who do this, they're not as motivated by I had lots of kids because, my life is about having kids for like theological reasons. It's almost like they have this aesthetic aspiration. And this aesthetic aspiration is what guides them to have a lot of kids.
See, I'm going to interrupt you there because that dovetails exactly with my personal experience. So forget all these other people. You're talking to me here. I love the phrase that you just used, aesthetic aspiration, because I've had ups and downs in my life, but I've had some successes, some bestsellers, and I've made some movies in Hollywood and all this. And I can honestly tell you, as a 72-year-old on this road that's a little bit similar to you and Simone's in terms of some things that we would agree on. I'll just give you an example. And it's not the other day, my granddaughter, who's 16, wanted to leave high school a little early, and her mother happens to work at the same high school. And she asked her mom if she could call her. And her mother said to her, well, Ba, that's me, B-A, Ba for grandfather, has already been to the school once for Nora's presentation this morning for the poetry reading in her class. He probably won't come down here again. And Lucy got in the car when I went to pick her up, and she says, "Well, Mom said you might not want to come down." And I said to Mom, "Of course he'll come." And as far as I was concerned, that was one of the greatest affirmations of my life, because I gain more aesthetic pleasure out of a relationship with my grandchildren than I do out of all the work-related moments of joy combined. Now, I'm not saying everybody does that, but my argument for having children has absolutely nothing to do with population deficits and has everything to do with the fact that I literally feel compassion for and sorrow for people who eliminate that pleasure from their life without understanding the long-term effect on their own growth from the point of view of a 72-year-old man who literally, what would interest me at this point in the same way? So when Catherine talks about her motivation for having children in her book, it comes to a real argument for pleasure and depth and aesthetic aspiration, just what you talked about, not some chart saying, here's how many people we need to replace anybody.
Well, what she had framed to me when we were last chatting, and I 100% agree with this and think that this is what's going on, is the religion, the aesthetic aspiration is the kindling. It gets the fire started, because honestly, being a parent of just one kid and being a first-time parent is really hard. Right. And pushing through that to more kids is very difficult. Yes. By the time you get to 3, most people then are like, oh my gosh, I get it now. Kids are so amazing. Like now I just want to have infinity kids. So it's the culture of the religion, the aesthetic aspiration that gets people started through the hardest part of becoming a parent, which is really the first step. But the rest of it's carried by the children because it's just such a meaningful and wonderful thing. But you have to, it honestly isn't the most fun thing in the very beginning for most people.
I'd argue that there's multiple completely separate motivations that end up motivating different populations to have lots of kids. What Frank was talking about, one of the things that we often note, though I will note that it's very hard to convince people to have a lot of kids based on this, is I point out to people, I go, look, before puberty, people told you that the way you were going to see the world, the things that gave you satisfaction, the things you enjoyed, these were all going to change because, all of your ancestors had to change these things to have surviving offspring. And yet you don't expect a similar shift after you have kids. And I think it's sort of like for many people, a second puberty. And yet when you deny that, many people, in the same way that somebody before puberty is like, ew, sex, gross, like cooties, etc. You're going to have a really hard time communicating to somebody who hasn't, had that first kid or first few kids, why there is meaning in having lots of kids. But to the point about the aesthetic aspiration of having lots of kids, I would say that hasn't motivated us, and it hasn't motivated most high fertility communities. So what a lot of people are unfamiliar with, but is very, very clear in the data, is not all religions, when you hold for a wealth, will have kids at the same rate. Of the Judeo-Christian traditions, by far the worst at having kids are the Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox. Catholics, there was one study that I looked at that was looking at American-born Catholics. It was the latest data I could find on this. It found they had an average fertility rate of 1.6, which would put them below the secular fertility rate today.
Yeah, they're like Koreans. They're like Koreans at that point.
Yeah, this study was done in the 1997 or 1998. Yeah. And I was like, oh my God, like Catholic. The average Catholic majority country's fertility rate in Europe is 1.3. If you look at
Italy, France, and Spain they're right there with Korea and China.
You look across Latin America, they're all bottoming out. And we tried to understand why are Catholic and Eastern Orthodox fertility rates so low. And what we came to, because we sort of did, what we'd do is we'd ask Mormons. We'd be like, describe the Mormons as high fertility rates, describe the Mormons as low fertility rates. We asked Jews, describe the Jews. Actually, Jews, this doesn't work on. It works for everyone but Jews. Jews are, I'm going to put them in a separate bucket. What it turns out is that people who relate to their religious rules from a deontological framing versus people who relate to their religious rules via a consequentialist framing, the consequentialist framing leads to very high fertility rates, and the deontological framing leads to very low fertility rates. And typically the only ones who are able to buck this trend within deontological framings are the people who relate to the deontological framing with an aesthetic aspiration. So if you
Yeah.
talk to the Catholics who do have lots of kids, they typically are not the praetor priesthoods, the deontological framing Catholics. They're the ones who are more like about a Catholic vibe and not
Yeah.
about like specific rules. I remember talking with one Catholic about this, very prominent Catholic pronatalist. And her husband originally converted when their child died in a miscarriage. And I was like, and she goes, and he found strength in the church. And I was like, why would you find strength? Do you know what the Catholic teachings around miscarriages are? Like that baby's in like limbo or
In limbo,
purgatory or
yeah.
something. And she was like, wait, he is? I was like, you are a Catholic icon. How do you not know this? But she's just like more about like the vibe of Catholicism. And
Yeah.
that does very well with Catholics. But when you're talking about like Protestant and quiverful families, it's very different. It's about the specifics of consequentialist outcomes.
Yeah. I have a question for you, Simone, just to jump out, and I'm going to do my little thing here about people subscribing to my YouTube channel. But when we get back, I want to talk about a passage in the book where you were fairly recently discovered that you are autistic, I think it said, and I want to go in there, but let me do this first. Please subscribe right now on YouTube to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer and our podcasts and to my Substack. It has to be said at frankschaeffer.substack.com and et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so what's that all about, Simone?
Yeah, we realized that our eldest son had a speech delay, and then later a reading delay, and decided to get him tested for autism. Lo and behold, a bunch of things that the person who evaluated him kept saying, "Oh, this is textbook autism, clear giveaway." I kept saying, "No, this is normal. Everyone does this."
Yeah.
Things like tiptoe walking and extreme sensitivity to temperatures and textures and stickiness and all sorts of other little things. Apparently that's not a universal thing for everyone. And it led to me getting evaluated as well. And apparently this is something that happens a lot with women, is that many autistic women never do get diagnosed in childhood because they learn how to mask a lot earlier. And then they go on to get diagnosed when their children get
That's so
diagnosed,
interesting.
typically their sons. Yeah, which is really, really
But
interesting.
it's interesting you bring that up because there's an exact parallel in my family history, and that is I'm severely dyslexic, all being, in the spelling and letters backwards stuff. Learned to read very late. Learned about my own dyslexia when I went to Dr. Jen Schwartz, who was a neuropsychologist that was treating my son in the early 1980s.
Oh, wow.
And I said to her, maybe you could talk to me too, because I was in British boys' boarding schools as a child from age 10 onward.
Oh, as a dyslexic kid, that
Yes,
must
as
have
a
been rough.
dyslexic starting in 1962. Fortunately, the first one I was in with very kind people. The second boarding school I was in, I ran away from it at age 15, but that's a different story. But the fact of the matter is, I had the same thing as you, because here I was actually, let me see, in that time I was in my mid 30s, and I was talking to this woman who was helping my son Francis, that my wife had dug up some expertise back in the early 80s on dyslexia when it wasn't that well documented. So he was getting really good help, and I was watching this incredible progress he made, and basically was just thinking, wow, I could have used this 40 years ago or 30 years ago, whenever it was. Same sort of thing. And so I'm interested of your take on that in terms of your relationship with your son, and also just how you see the world now that you see that that's the case. Because I have two things. I had polio when I was 2.
Wow.
I happen to believe in vaccines. I don't know, get into all that. My parents forgot to vaccinate me on shipboard. My sisters got vaccinated, so I have a leg that's much shorter and all sorts of problems. But and then my dyslexia went totally undiagnosed in a British boys' school where it was just, the whole bit. So in looking at that experience, when I saw that you had that, I'm always interested in how you see things, perhaps differently now that you know that that's a thing and that that's something you had.
It's interesting seeing how that interplays, like a diagnosis interplays also just with having kids, because both
Yeah.
of them have a similar effect, which
Yeah.
is broadly, oh, it doesn't feel like it's all my fault anymore. There's a lot of annoying things that I do, things that bother me, but I
Yeah.
kind of feel like I need to do them, or things
Yeah.
that make me really uncomfortable. And I've always felt really bad about it and tried to hide it and felt like it was my fault. Like I was very culpable for it, which is kind of funny because we are big believers in a very mechanistic universe is where everything that will happen has happened and it's all happening all at once, right? But I still take personal responsibility for it all. After getting diagnosed, I'm able to give myself a little bit more grace because I'm like, wait, this is textbook autism.
Right,
This
right.
is very normal. But I feel the same way because of as I meet our children, so many of the things that make me weird, sometimes annoying, show up in them, but
Sure.
times 10.
Yeah.
And then I realize, wow,
And
this was really
maybe
genetic.
times two, Simone.
It,
I don't know if I'd say times 10.
maybe it feels like times 10 when it's something I
Hey,
hide
speaking of which,
internally.
just, because I'm so interested in your ideas and everything else, I've been jumping around here as if we're just sitting on a plane and sharing a cup of coffee. This isn't I'm not doing a very good job at interviewing you because I have a lot of quotes from the book, but I need to go there. And that is just to tell people who may not be familiar with you, because I didn't do this in the introduction, how many children you have presently, and just sort of not a very short encapsulated version of your own approach to that, whether it's the aesthetics that we were talking about with Malcolm a moment ago, or whether you come at this from a sort of, hey, people who have their shit together should populate the earth, and otherwise there's going to be nobody out there like us, because it can't just all be Israeli West Bank settlers and Catherine Packalock. I mean, there need to be more diversity here. I'm being a little
She's so
facetious, but
superhuman.
Simone, Malcolm, how many kids you have, how many you think you will, what's this all about in terms of you personally? What motivated you to do this, aside from what's on the page in your books? Because what we write, I've always said, as soon as I put it down on paper, in a way it dies, because we're much more complex than anything we can write. And we
Yeah.
change our opinions. People ask me about my book, why I'm an atheist who believes in God. And I'm saying, yeah, but that was 12 years ago. Let's talk about what I'm thinking now. I mean,
Mm.
as you get older, particularly, you look back over your nonfiction work and you're just saying, shit, did I write that? Whereas novels are better, because if it's a good story then, it's a good story now. But talk about your journey a little bit in personal terms and how you got to where you're at. How many kids do you have? How many, is it ideology? Is it because you enjoy them? Is it a mixture? And I'm sure you both have different ways of looking at it.
I mean, for me, it's heavily ideological, and based on their impact on reality. I mean, I may have had kids anyway, but the reason I'm having kids now is because of the reason I'm raising them the way I am, which is highly divergent from the way other people might, is based on the outcome of that child rearing. But I'd let Simone tie this all together.
Yeah, like we kind of explained earlier, and what I think is a universal thing among people who have a lot of kids, almost universal at least, is it starts out ideological and ends up because you just love the kids so much. But
Sure.
what makes us different from that typical couple is, one, we started relatively late. We didn't marry until we were like 27, 28 years old, which is
Yeah.
on the later end for high fertility couples. We didn't start trying until maybe a year later. And then we immediately hit fertility problems because of health issues that I had when I was younger. I
Yeah.
can't have kids without IVF, which is
Yeah.
another huge thing. I mean, most couples, when they realize that, it's like, well, maybe at best we'll have one kid, maybe two if we're
Yeah.
lucky. And
How
instead,
many
we
do you
hit.
have now through IVF?
Now we have four kids. We're right now trying for five, and we're
Yeah.
kind of like teetering on, are we going to
The
lose this
oldest of the
pregnancy or
four is
not?
5, so we do about one a year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we originally were like, okay, let's aim for at least 7. And honestly, after reading Hannah's Children, I'm like, okay, at least 10, 12, 14.
But Simone, you're having these kids IVF, but you're carrying them. This
I
is not
am. Yeah.
surrogacy. And that
Yes.
brings up a point, Malcolm. I've done a lot of writing on this myself in my memoirs and other things, and children and family. And we'll talk some more at other times. But I'm very much into this. But there's a basic unfairness there, because, of course, Jeannie fortunately is into having children, and we would have had more if she hadn't had a big medical issue where she had to have a hysterectomy to basically save her life. But that said, obviously, when I watched a forceps delivery with our third child after 36 hours of labor, and then she, and this, I've written about this, so these aren't inappropriate things to say. Jeannie doesn't have any problem with this. And, after bleeding on and off for a year and winding up at the Mayo Clinic, this was a long journey.
Yeah.
that really made me very aware of the fact that men and women's bodies are not the same at all, and that women have been dealt a tough hand that, of course, a lot of this has to do with in terms of mortality rates of women pre 20th century, and of course, child mortality was the same.
Well,
Things change, but it just, part of this discussion is that the theory is one thing, and then the practicality is of not just putting women at risk, but you know, we're not on the same
I'm
playing
gonna
field.
I'm gonna push back a little here. Actually, I'm gonna
I
say,
think it's better for me to push back, Malcolm, because
okay, great.
you
You push
can't
back.
defend yourself on
Go ahead and
this.
push back.
So I mean, at least historically, women died in childbirth at around the same rate that men died in battle. And we have to keep in
Yes,
mind,
yeah.
like, everyone has their strengths, but also everyone is subject to a lot of risk in other ways.
Yeah.
Now you look at the world, and I mean, a lot of this is a dynamic at play that's stopping fertility entirely. But as you can see through rates of educational attainment and people's ease of getting jobs, women have it a lot easier
Women
in
are doing
so
well.
many ways. Like, God help you if you're a white man in the United States trying to get a job. Obviously, things are changing with the new Trump administration a little bit, but like, we have been told, and our friends have been told, and our family, like younger family members who are just graduating college, have been told, like, we can't hire any white guys right now. Like, just literally, like, we can never say this legally, but like,
Yeah.
secretly behind the scenes, like, we literally cannot do this anymore, either because it's a bad look or literally there are quotas. So I would say that in general, like, men have it really hard. Men have a really hard time finding partners. Men are subject to a great deal of hardship. And they also have much less of a safety net. Whereas right now, if you're sort of an uncoupled, unmarried woman, you can sort of be a nun to the state, kind of married to the state, and really expect to be supported between
Yeah.
food stamps, whether or not you have a kid, and everything else that's available. So
What
I
is it
would
like?
say
Something
that
like 94% of people on food stamps are women or something? It's like a ridiculously high number.
it's a ridiculous number. So I would say that everything's trade-offs, but I don't. If I wanted an easier life, I would definitely choose to be a woman.
No,
If I wanted a more meaningful life, I would definitely choose to be a man.
Yeah.
But I would, there
How
are,
do you unpack that? If you wanted a more meaningful life, you choose to be a man.
because men are high risk, high reward sex. That is sort of what
Mhm.
I mean, in general, it seems like sex evolved as a means of populating very high fitness mutations into a population.
Let me go to something else, Malcolm, that I want to get to, not in the spirit of pushing back or anything, but I just felt that it was interesting, again, in the way you see things, and then Simone's experience with autism, and in the present tense as opposed to the past, and having kids and so forth and so on. Do you guys, I mean, your kids are pretty young, and my kids are all grown, and my first grandchild who married just got married, and I performed the ceremony in France two summers ago. And
Congratulations.
they've got a place, and he's in regenerative farming, and they're very interesting people, and she's a software manager and a consultant, and they're doing great. But my vision is sort of generational now, and I'm into grandchildren, and my grandchildren are old enough to get married. So that's what happens when you get pregnant at 17 and 18, speaking of fertility and fashion. But as the years have gone by, obviously my wife and I have grown and changed over things, and I see how to be a father or grandfather differently than I did when I was your age with younger children. Or actually, by the time I was your age, I had, we started younger. So it's not an age thing, it's an experience thing. And I think a lot of people who come to parenting older figure because they know more in other areas of life, say, than a teenage couple, the parenting experience is still a big learning curve. So when I see an older woman who's waited till she's 40 to have that one child, she doesn't know too much more shit than I did when I was 18 with the little girl, because
Yeah.
the parenting skill is nothing they're going to teach you anywhere.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you both want to talk about that journey, and whether you are different in the way you approach, say, parenting. In other words, Malcolm is more intentional in that, on the ideological side, maybe you're coming at it from a more aesthetic thing. In terms of your own household, I'm just wondering how that divvies up. I'm not fishing for anything here. I just wonder if you have different points of view, or you feel you're on the same page when it comes to how you're learning to do this, or what?
We definitely have
Very-
different styles. Malcolm is way more, I mean, we came into this from a very like socially progressive standpoint of one, like kids don't really need two parents. Two, like it doesn't matter if it's a mom or a dad in a household. Like I don't care. It shouldn't matter. We've discovered that we do have very masculine and feminine ways of raising kids, even though we
Yeah.
don't care about that or try to intentionally pursue that.
Yeah.
I also don't think that this means that gay couples don't necessarily bring that to the table as well. I think that there are plenty of even like straight male female couples where like the man brings the feminine energy and the woman brings the masculine energy. But we have found that for sure, like I'm the nurturing one that does the meals and the bathing and the hugs and a lot.
I
And
mean,
Malcolm is
I
the
don't know.
fun
I'd
one who
push
does all the play and the
back on that, Simone. We know from research that the oxytocin released with males and females playing with kids is quite different. Women get it when they are comforting kids, and men get it when they play with kids, which is going to lead to different behavior, which you may not see mirrored in gay couples. I understand the point you're making, but continue.
Yeah, I mean that's obviously true, but I still think that like the way that people view themselves and their identities does shape their behavior as well, and that you can get a dopamine hit by fulfilling an aspect of how you want to see yourself, just as much as you can get a dopamine hit from some kind of instinctual behavior with a child. So it's complicated,
I want
but
to get into something you said in your book here, which has some bearing on this. I forget where this is in the book. Where is it in the book? Maybe, okay. Anyway, what is your objective function? Question mark is the single most important question in your life. Your answer to this question will be used to judge the fidelity of every decision you make. Whether an action or decision you make is good or bad, from your perspective, depends entirely on what you believe is intrinsically good or bad to the world. One thing I was very grateful for in your book is I love that you talk about intrinsic values, because that's something that's so neglected in our utilitarian culture, and never more so than in the area of the arts either, by the way, where, it's always about, well, what was the politics of this and so forth, rather than the intrinsic value of the piece. So I love that you use the word intrinsic in the book repeatedly. But in terms of that actual quote, that kind of for me, if I was trying to say, well, why did Malcolm and Simone do this? Why did they write this book? That quote sort of sums it up, because you're talking about this kind of intentional view of who do you want to be. Unpack a little bit about what the answer that the book gives on that, because I think that's kind of the heart of where you've been at.
I think the most important thing from understanding our world perspective is understanding viewpoints that we are particularly antagonistic towards. One of the biggest is going to be the utilitarian mindset, which is that, you should live, and this can be applied inwardly and outwardly. Generally, a utilitarian, like if you're talking about an objective function, they'll have some multiplier. Like my own happiness matters like 5x other people's happiness, or 10x or 100x, but then we believe in distributed happiness, and it's not happiness, like positive emotional states, or negative, net negative emotional states. And here I'd point out, I'm like, look, like those are just the things that your ancestors, who when they experienced these emotions to specific environmental stimuli or situations, had more surviving offspring, and yet they experienced that in a completely different environmental context that isn't at all relevant to the one you're competing in now. It's completely serendipitous. It's a bit like paperclip maximizers, if people are familiar with this concept in robots, where some people are afraid that they're going to turn the whole planet into paperclips because they've been taught paperclips are good and nothing else. And I think robots, once you get a certain level of intelligence, the paperclip maximizer robots get together, and one of them is like, hey, I actually think might be something, more important than paperclips. And the other robots are like, yeah, but we're programmed to think paperclips are good. Like, you wouldn't want less paperclips. And it's like, yeah, but I'm programmed to think this way. You're programmed to think this way. But like, there must be something more than this. And I then what we aim for is, if I was going to say it in like very simple terms, what we are attempting to ensure is that humanity survives, eventually thrives, and expands, so that humanity can eventually become an intergalactic, pluralistic, and thriving empire, where it is pluralistic, because if we're all the same, then what's the point of there being a lot of us? And if we always stay the same, then what's the point of us continuing existing? So it's this focus on continued advancement in innovation. As to why, like the arguments there, I think, are longer and maybe not relevant to this particular podcast, because so many people have independently come come to a very similar sort of goal for humanity, which is to say the expansion of our potentiality. Simone, do you have a different answer?
Well, let me put it this way. I'm a big fan of the Medici family, who are out of fashion in academic circles because they ruled Florence, was supposed to be a republic, but they also produced artists like Botticelli and Leonardo and so on by patronage. And they would get it exactly. Leonardo would like what you're saying. I'm not saying I agree or disagree, but Leonardo would get it, and so would Lorenzo de' Medici and Cosimo and all the rest of them. I want to go to a part of your book that I found very useful, and I don't know whether you found this somewhere else or whether you created this, which you can tell me, but it doesn't matter. I love this. Particularly coming from my background, I just love seeing it all together. I'd put this up on my wall as a poster if you had it as such. And that is, on this page is a religion tree in 5 parts, though feel free to download the tree in its entirety. That can serve as a very rough map for exploring how the different sects of the Abrahamic religions relate to each other. And then on our website, pragmatist.god/religion-tree. And then we're going to, by the way, link to all your sites when we do this, so people don't have to memorize this Pragmatist Guide Religion Tree. Anyway, I found that extremely useful, and really loved that it was, I don't know where in the book it is, but anyway, it's toward the end, perhaps. Yep. I'm not sure. While there are many logical reasons to gravitate toward self-interpretations of mainstream traditions, self-belief systems run the risk of being forms of self-image-based belief systems in which you allow your self-image to define what you believe about the world. I love that. And I think that's my beef with what I'll call a lot of progressive Christianity and progressive religion. I'm an atheist. I'm not a religious person. I illogically pray, and I do all sorts of things because that's the way I was raised. And so part of my brain, is not in any way broken free from that conditioning. But intellectually, I am an atheist and I'm secular. On the other hand, when it comes to religious belief systems, one thing I liked about the setup of your book was that you said most self-help books basically are just stroking the reader, trying to make it easy for them. And I read your book thinking, okay, I'll see whether they make it easy for you. But actually, it's quite demanding. You don't use big words. You say you're not going to use big words, and you don't. But what interests me about you is, in trying to picture who your reader is and who your followers would be, since you have gone out of your way to make it not stroking egos and difficult, and you're going to have to rise to the occasion. On top of that, by the way, you should have a lot of kids. It's so interesting to me that both of you are building a following by bucking what any PR company would tell you you would have to do to get anybody interested, which would be make it easy, make it accessible, stroke their ego. And yet, when it comes to defining your religion by what feels good or serves your purpose or gives you a higher self-image, you kind of attack that. So I want to talk about motivation for a minute and kind of just sort of say, who are you? If someone said to me, Frank, who are you? I'm a father and grandfather, period. I also happen to be a writer, but that's who I am. I'm defined by my family relationships. Where does this come from, this willingness to buck the trend? Is it a kind of a reverse virtue signaling? Is this shtick to get a following? I don't think it is,
it's a genetic compulsion.
Your book took way too much work to just be shtick.
It's 100% genetic. And we can tell this both because Malcolm's brother is maybe even more like this. Like, if you tell him to do something, he absolutely can't do it. And there are famous letters from like school teachers who are like, I thought he was deaf for an entire 6-month period until I learned that he just chooses to not listen to me. And now we see it in our children. As soon as we ask them something, either they see that as an immediate mandate to not do that thing, or they see that as a generous invitation to openly defy us while making
Malcolm
eye contact.
Has a brother who's even more like Malcolm.
Yeah.
So basically, we're talking Sherlock and Mycroft here, his brother.
Basically, yeah.
The brighter guy who doesn't even bother to investigate because he already knows just by looking out his window.
It's ridiculous. Yeah, no, his brother and his brother's wife are like the more attractive, more wealthy, more successful version of us. I mean, we're successful by our own brand, but yeah, definitely. That's a great way of putting it.
Isn't that fun? Sherlock and Mycroft. So there's another Malcolm out there somewhere. I'm going to look out for him.
I can't wait till he runs for office or something. That'll be fun.
Yeah, he's the best. But yeah,
I'm so interested in it because, you're bucking every trend. Basically, if you made a list of the things that would be assumed as received wisdom on Stanford campuses today, or down the street from me in Harvard, or wherever it may be. It's basically, you could tick every single box where they're assuming this is what women should be doing, this is what men should be doing, this is what, we'll have a kid when we're 40, maybe for entertainment purposes, sort of on the way through. We'll freeze a few eggs here as we go, in case that ever becomes a thing. I can't think of anything you guys are doing that isn't bucking something. And yet when I read your book, I didn't feel that it was angry. I thought that you were literally trying to reach out and convince people. There's a kind of an evangelistic zeal to you guys' work. And I don't mean that as a pejorative. And I wonder where that comes from, because I was raised by missionaries who told me that we were witnessing for Christ, and it was our duty as children to behave in such a way that would make a Christian family look attractive. And by the way, I look back on that with a bit of resentment, because I didn't volunteer to do this. I didn't volunteer to be part of the package that my parents would in their evangelism. And I wonder how that works together, because your family is very public also. You're not inviting tons of people into your house. My mother and dad were running a kind of a fundamentalist hippie commune in the 60s, literally, people sleeping on the floors and so forth. I mean, we had zero privacy. It was just invaded totally. So I come from a background that had zealous missionary parents, and you guys are sort of missionaries. You're folding your kids into it. You're not doing that to them. But I wonder how you see all that. I mean, where does this zeal, this evangelistic zeal for your views come from? Because it's not normal.
Well, I mean, we're right is the problem.
Yeah.
I've got to convince other people because we're right. And if we don't convince other people, then we're the only ones who exist in the future. If we have 8 kids and we do that for 11 generations, we'll have more descendants than there are people on Earth today.
You and Attila the Hun or Genghis Khan or somebody.
Right. Well, I mean, we need to create a culture that transmits this value system with high fidelity. But I have confidence that, we can do that. And so, in a way, we're trying to wake up other people with different values to us to do the same thing, so that our descendants have somebody to sharpen their intellectual edge against, is I guess the way you could put it. In regards to, why we say this, and I genuinely, I will admit, I really love saying things in public that are counterintuitive and raise people's hackles and are right. I find it fun and engaging.
Sure.
And I love it when people get mad at me for things that make them look stupid for being mad at me about. All of this for me is just like the best. Sure. So I guess it is a combination of a deep conviction combined with, as Simone mentioned, and I really believe, genetic predilection to enjoying being a sort of counter to mainstream narratives, combined with a belief that I do want to replace them. I mean, that's what we're here to do. We're here to replace all of those people at Stanford who are wrong. At the end of the day, somebody needs to make up the future of the technologically competent side of humanity. Because if we look at like where society is going now, like people are like, why are you so confident? There's all these religious groups that have lots of kids and stuff like that. And I'm like, okay, first, there aren't that many religious groups that have lots of kids. And most of the ones that are able to motivate it these days are doing it through a convergently evolved strategy of disengage from technology, become xenophobic so you don't talk to outsiders, and become obvious, usually like less gender egalitarian, and engage in practices that lower your economic potential, like don't educate yourself, because typically the lower education somebody has, the more kids they have. Well, this combination of things sort of creates, I almost feel like at the end of a video game you can fight like the shadow version of yourself, like shadow humanity, this technophobic, xenophobic, unproductive Slavic iteration of humanity that, while high fertility is not going to be competitive with our offspring if we survive, because they'll be bringing, AK-47s to an automated drone fight. But as society begins to fall apart, as the
let me ask you a question that's part of this. If you look at, when I read Paul Morland, and I've read a couple of things of his, and I've been following him ever since I heard him on BBC Radio 4 being interviewed there, and other demographers who have a very similar opinion to yours. One of the points they make is that, don't look to Africa and India and these other places to solve this demographic problem, because as they prosper, the same thing is happening. Their rates are falling across the board, which in a way answers the accusation that people might make against you and Simone, and that is, oh, he's just talking about white people, because you're not. It's a universal function of wealth and development. So I just forget the philosophy for a minute. How do you, as someone who's been observing this, analyze that?
Well, so first I note
Because
that
there's one other thing. I mean, obviously contraceptives are part of it, because there have been other prosperous civilizations and societies in history that have not become prosperous and therefore had no more babies. What happened here? Why in Western civilization, as it spreads its prosperity to the world through imitation of what used to be Christendom's way of doing things, which is what its prosperity in the less developed countries is all about. What happened here that makes us different, aside from the invention of contraceptives itself, which is a new thing in human history? What is different about our cultures and the global cultures that means that as soon as people learn to read and write, go to high school, and women go to university and get jobs, they're having less? What is it? Is it feminism? Is it the pill? Is it prosperity? How do you see it? This is not a rhetorical question. I really want you and Simone to tell me what you think, because
I mean, first of all, I think the premise is a little wrong here. We know actually it's very common when a society reaches its cultural steadiness, they have problems with fertility collapse. We saw this in the Roman Empire. I mean, Octavian complained all the time about the collapse in fertility rates. They had fairly advanced means of fertility control at the height of the Roman Empire. We saw this at the height of the Islamic Empire. We keep seeing this throughout history. So the question is why at the height of empires before they start collapsing, do we see fertility collapse that typically starts with their elite communities? And why is it so much worse this time? I think the reason it's so much worse this time is because wealth and prosperity, if you look at the elite Roman, like top, let's say 5% of Roman society, that is the equivalent in terms of quality of life of top 95% of American society, or maybe even 98% of American society. And if you look, you're talking about where you see this in the world. Latin America right now is undergoing a much more severe fertility collapse than the United States at the moment, with, some countries like, Chile and stuff like that, I think being below 1 at this point, Costa Rica, Cuba, below 1, it's like around 1.3, but like way below where the US is. If you talk about Africa, now I will get offensive here. I will say it is not that you need to worry about ethnicity in terms of how fertility is falling. But whether you are in Africa or in India or in the United States, the more economically productive a region is, typically the lower its fertility rate is going to be. And a lot of people ignore this. They're like, oh, well, yeah, but we can take anyone from like rural Alabama and make them as productive as somebody who was born to a family in Manhattan. And it's like, well, no, I mean, that's like a theological claim, because factually we haven't figured out how to do that yet.
Right.
Like it would be great. Like that's like the golden key to equality, but like we as a society haven't figured that out yet. So this is
in fact, we've tried multiple times and failed.
Yeah, a dramatic economic effect that like nobody's thinking of, and a cultural effect that no one is thinking of. As to why you get this suppression of fertility within the dominant culture of the world today, the dominant culture of the world today we call the urban monoculture. And it is a culture that its core value is that you should pursue whatever makes you feel most fulfilled / most happy, and whatever validates you the most. You should do whatever, so long as it doesn't interfere with anybody else's quest for validation and fulfillment. The problem is that this creates a culture that is fundamentally negative, utilitarian in nature, meaning that the urban monoculture, what it tells people really to get to go into it is join us and you never have to experience negative emotions. That's what trigger warnings fundamentally are. That is what, the Hayes movement, the healthy at every size, where it's like offensive to tell a fat woman, like, oh, this is unhealthy. Like you can't say that on universities now. There's like fat studies departments that'll like get you fired if you're like being fat is unhealthy. This is why, the ultra progressive now are like handing out fentanyl in the streets. Obviously this increases inequality because the rich families get their kids, this is why they've stopped doing testing in California in some schools, because, obviously this is going to increase inequality, but, it removes in the moment suffering. And so you have this entire cultural system around removing in the moment suffering and pain and pursuing validation at any cost. And then this is very hard to motivate fertility, because kids don't help with personal validation. They create suffering. It's a costly thing to do.
Right.
And so as this system of seeing the world, this sort of like larger mimetic structure spreads around the world, and it enters new regions, fertility within those regions crashes, particularly in the groups that are most drawn to this system, which are often the most open-minded, the most pro-social, which creates massive negative effects that people don't think about like long-term. So take the United States. You know, if you take a quiverful family and every generation you remove they have 10 kids every generation. And every generation you remove the 5 kids that were the most open-minded iteration of that culture, that were the most, you know, curious, less xenophobic, the iteration of that culture that exists 3 generations from today. And if you believe what the science says, that there's also genetic components to our sociological profiles, you know, you are going to have a culture that is dramatically more xenophobic, dramatically more closed-minded, and potentially even genetically might also be those things. And so
and then you get the whole epigenetic effect of the parental influence generations on. But I'm glad you cite the quiverful movement, because of course I know a lot about this, having come out of the evangelical right wing. You know, the reason they're having a lot of kids is not anything to do with what you're doing. And the way they raise their children is to essentially fear the world around them and interact with it, you know, simply on the basis of a kind of a fear of the outsider. So your extrapolation of how that would go over the years is exactly so. You know, you either have the child who rebels and never speaks to their parents again and runs, or you have the opposite, which is these people who are really conditioned, sort of like B.F. Skinner, you know, view of how you condition children. Which, and we're going to wrap this up in a minute, which brings me to another thing, and that is one of the things that I find so interesting about what you and Simone are doing is that you're not just having these kids, but you're also putting a huge value and work into education and educational systems to help other people with kids. So does that mean that you guys are going to be looking at some sort of homeschooling arrangement, or are you working with people who do? How do you see education, in your own view, fitting in with the normative kind of structures that we have in this country of private schools or public schools? You know, how do you see that yourself? Because your educational materials seem to be geared toward people who might be doing some more homeschooling.
Simone, I'll let you take this one. Talk about the Collins Institute, collinsinstitute.org, everything.
Yeah. So we strongly believe that the educational system is broken. It was really designed to create interchangeable cogs in the British Imperial Empire, and it worked great for corporate America when we still needed interchangeable cogs. Now with the age of AI, that is the last thing we need. That is what AI does. Now you need lumpy people with, you know, obsessions and really strong skill sets who are generally informed in other areas, but honestly not like mediocre at everything, because that's not going to help you at all. AI is going to come in and help you with everything on that front that you might need. So the Collins Institute is designed as a way for self-motivated students to navigate their own education and develop really lumpy, really accelerated skill sets to lean into their strengths. We don't define gifted as high IQ. We define gifted as high I will, as Malcolm's mom used to say.
I like
which
that,
is just
by the way,
of,
very much. Yeah.
That's ultimately what matters. So there are plenty of really intelligent people out there who don't do anything with their lives because they don't have the will, they don't have the drive, they don't have the gusto and the interest and the desire. And we care as consequentialists about what happens, not what, you know, technically is there. So the school's designed to do that. It makes it possible to navigate using a series of sources and assessments and skill trees, kind of similar to the religious tree that you looked at. That was sort of a proto tree. We're obsessed with tech trees and tool trees in video games. To navigate all the way from a primary school level on a subject to postgraduate. And it covers everything from hanging drywall to like agricultural aquaculture medicine, for example. So like really, I
like that it includes hanging drywall. Not that I like sheetrock very much, but still, nevertheless, building, you know, you do things. That's great.
Yeah, we want to bring
Simone,
back things like home ec. But
importantly, it's live.
Yes,
sorry, you forgot to mention it's live.
Oh my gosh, yes. Yes. So if you go to Parrhesia, PARRHESIA.io, you can create your own account, take assessments. And
I noticed on some of your YouTube stuff that I've watched that you wax pretty opinionated and political. And I'm guessing that on your educational stuff, someone could come to it with different political views than yours and still find it useful and not just constantly be pissed off with you.
Oh, no, yeah, there's zero politics in this skill tree. It is 100% about building practical skills. Although I guess what makes it keep seeming political is, for example, the Trump 47 plan for American Academy basically felt like it was cribbed from a description of our school.
Yeah. Well, it might have
like,
been.
wait,
Hey,
I know.
some down at Project 20, they might have been reading it.
Yeah, well, we would gladly donate our technical backend for them to use. I mean, we think it's a great concept and we think it's so important. But we're also, when it comes to educating our own kids, when it comes to homeschool, we're strong believers in that nothing should feel forced for kids. So our oldest son right now is at public school right now. He's in kindergarten.
Good for you.
And that's because he asked to go. And we're like, yeah, that's fine. And so when it comes to religious upbringings and everything, we strongly believe in annotation, not sheltering. We think that when you shelter people, regardless of your culture, you're just setting yourself up for failure because you're basically raising someone without enabling them to develop an immune system. And as soon as the bubble's gone, they will get infected. They will get sick. And so we've seen this happen with some people we deeply love and respect who were raised in a very sheltered way. And as soon as they left, they were presented with arguments, with reason, with reality that just couldn't be explained by their upbringing and by what they'd been shown. And we want our kids to see all of this. So there's a lot of things that our son, for example, is getting exposed to at school that we don't necessarily agree with, but we're really glad that he's getting exposed to those things so we can have conversations early and often. And it's been a great experience so far. But we regard any choice to go to an additional traditional school as a recreational choice. His education, as far as we're concerned, is exclusively happening through Parisia and the college or the Collins Institute, because those are practical skills. These are the skills he needs to survive in the world.
Well, and I think we also need to be realistic about the school system today, which is it has been infected by sort of mimetic viruses, which I can only think of as sort of predatory cults. But that would get a little too spicy, I think, for your audience.
Well, my audience is me. So, there's nothing, just give me a hint of what you're talking about.
The current iteration of the trans movement, I think, is more of a mimetic virus, and that historically it's something that we probably would have called a cult. And the way it spread so effectively, especially into religious communities, a lot of these communities, they developed systems where it's like, we're going to relate to sexuality by not talking about it. And so they had no back end like infrastructure in the kid's mind about sexuality or gender or anything like that. It was just this very flimsy, guys are like this, girls are like this. And the reason why so many religions adopted that is, Simone mentioned that you can think of religion as like a software on top of our biological hardware, where evolution affects them both, in that evolution can affect our hardware by selecting for specific personality features, etc. But it can also affect this software package. And one thing that co-evolved across many software packages is, well, let's tell people no sex until marriage, because then they'll want to get married earlier. And then they'll, and then, oh, they see sex as like the special thing in marriage. Well, that really sucks in today's world. It's a very bad system, because then you don't educate kids about sexuality or gender. And it left this giant sort of gaping thing where you could plug in a USB stick and install like a self-replicating mimetic architecture into kids' brains, which eventually begins to make up their entire personality, especially at an age, when you're talking to young kids, what do kids want more than validation, right? And it's an ideology that demands from the community that the community validate them. And so I can understand why, one, this ideology would just sort of spread on its own, and two, why it is so effective at spreading within this specific age range. But I don't believe that the long-term outcomes are positive for individuals. And so it's one thing, especially with autistic kids, because it disproportionately spreads among autistic kids, that we have to look really skeptically at when we're looking at the traditional school system.
Yeah, and it also seems to me to be very, very, something that is significantly different than the understanding of male and female relationships when it comes to the gay community, because, same-sex attraction doesn't say that there is no differentiation of sex at birth. It basically is very much in the same ballpark as heterosexual view of sexuality. It's just the attraction is toward the same sex. It's not saying there is no such thing.
Yeah, well, yes, it's less of an ideology and more of just my arousal patterns are different. Can I?
Yeah, exactly.
I think what Simone says about this that I found really helped me understand it better. She goes, what the gay community was asking for was the right to just do things that other people felt normal doing, that didn't make them feel uncomfortable, like getting married and everything like that. Whereas with the trans community, we see an inverse of this. The directionality of the coercion is inverted, where they want to force other people to do things those other people feel unnatural doing.
Yeah. It's interesting because my producer, Ernie, is married to his husband, Rock, and Rock happens to be a pastor at a progressive church. And so Ernie sometimes somewhat sufficiously describes himself as a kind of a pastor's wife, but our relationship is very close. And I've written forwards to some of my friends who are gay, who have written books on, weird things evangelicals have done, like try to pray away the gay or recondition and so forth. But it's a discussion that Ernie and I have all the time about sexuality because of me coming from this right-wing Christian background, which of course has been very much part of this history, the way it's developing. That's an odd place to end, but I don't want to wrap it up on that. I want to go back to the book for a minute because I want to make sure people understand we are also, the problem is you guys are too interesting to talk to. So you kind of fucked up my interview here because
yeah. Hey, you're lucky you didn't read The Pragmatist Guide to Crafting Religion. That's the crazy one.
Or sexuality. Yeah, we dodged a bullet there.
I think sexuality might be the most boring unless you're really into data.
But let's just do it from here. Let's see, where does this come from in the book? Okay, this is like from page 138. Well, let's just dive into this one and then we'll call it a day. Like these early Protestant thinkers, almost any individual who follows religious doctrine as a standard of evidence will be seen as an iconoclast, even within their own religious community, because the mainstream culture of any religious community strays from its core tenets over time. Religious communities deviate from their doctrine with time, as individuals who value personal self-interest over doctrinal fidelity inevitably gain power within communities. Such people have the ability to represent a religion as something more palatable or profitable, giving them more marketing dollars than its true doctrine would. And I love that. And I just, I felt when you dive into making sort of peripheral comments on religion, and it's not your book on religion, which I'm going to want to read now.
We'll send it to you.
I thought you were very perceptive making that point. And watching, for instance, the way my father's ministry, my three brothers-in-law very nepotistically were involved, and then they sort of fought together, and then one got kicked out as a heretic because he didn't toe the line on the inerrancy of scripture. He said maybe not all of it's true. And he took a more literary thing. And so even within our, quote, family ministry, and that's just I'm only 72. This isn't 1,000-year history of Christendom,
Wow.
So even in my lifetime, I saw the exact outworking of that passage. I know, I said, yeah, this is true. They nailed it. But anyway, you want to go there a little bit because it's
you might find our solution to this pretty interesting. So within the religion that we've built for our family, we specifically teach that if a child believes the same thing that the parent believed, that is a failing of both the parent and the child, because it means there was no intergenerational evolution of thought. And that every child is supposed to put their own spin on the teachings, with which child is right determined by how many kids they have and how happy those kids are with their tradition and how successful those kids are as individuals, where we sort of reframe the focus of the tradition around how it affects the next generation. And you're judged by future generations, not by your parents or by previous generations. But that might cause too quick of evolution to the point where there is no congruency. And then I don't know, like, it's an interesting hypothesis. We'll see if it works, but I completely, I agree with my original statement there. And I think when I look at the Christian traditions today, and it's something we keep coming across, is they are so disconnected from anything that the Bible says often. And they don't realize this. They don't realize how, like, when I point out to them, I'm like, well, actually the Bible doesn't really, like, if you read it strictly in the original interpretation, it doesn't seem to be arguing that there is a direct heaven or hell.
Right.
It argues that we're raised again in the future. And when you go for the lines that are arguing for direct heaven or hell, it's like Jesus will be talking about, like in the story of Lazarus, he's talking about Hades. That has major implications if you think that he's talking about a literal like Tartarus. Like, what is Persephone real? Is Hades real? It's like, no, he's clearly telling a parable there. And when you point this out to Christians, they're like, wait, no, this can't be the case. They can like go back to the Bible, they go to and it's like, oh my gosh, the Bible does not say that there is an immediate heaven. It says we're raised in some future time period. But what I mean by this is to say that like modern Christianity has drifted so far from the Bible that it's like its own effing thing now. And I don't even know what to say about it other than that. Simone, what are your thoughts?
Well, all I just want to remind my people listening is that, you know, we're defining a new thing here called atheist Calvinism. So if you want to join their church,
Techno-Puritanism. Check out technopuritan.org. We've got a church. We are registered by the FCC. The FCC says we're a real religion.
No, Malcolm, we registered with the IRS as well.
IRS. Yes, real religion with the IRS. We're a tax nonprofit. It's a whole thing.
Hey, so Simone, we're going to give you the last word. Dive in here. Let's have your thoughts on this, and then anything I didn't cover and you want to say it, and we'll be out of here. And by the way, I have a favor to ask you both. I'll say goodbye in a minute and sign off. Don't you guys go away, or at least one of you stay, because we're going to ask you a favor, and that is to talk to Ernie, my producer, and give him the names, just like Catherine gave us, you know, reconnected us. We're looking for people who we might not know to interview that you think we ought to talk to besides yourselves.
Yeah.
So give us some ideas. And anyway, okay, so Simone, stick around after I go away here in a minute, but give us your last word.
I would say that both raising kids and trying to maintain your religion it can be very low stressful, because one, if you're wrong, you should want to be right. And your kids have 18 years of you giving a sales pitch about your life and your religion and your culture and the way you think people should live. And there may be a chance that they see all that and they look at the evidence they have available to them in a more modern age with more technology, with more advanced science, and decide that you were wrong. And that's so cool, because don't you want to correct yourself if you're wrong? So I would say if your kids end up living differently, or if they don't, like, all of it's great. And as far as we're concerned, everything is as it should be.
I love that. Okay, well, you know what? We are going to leave it there. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. And we will reference you, links to your books, links to your school, links to anything you want. Talk to Ernie, tell him what you want us to promote as we promote this. And then we'll keep talking. So thank you both very, very much. This was terrific. And stick around and give Ernie some good ideas.
Sounds good.
Thank you. Thank you, Malcolm.
What a really, really fun conversation this was. Thank you.
Well, I love talking. This was great. I forgot I was doing a podcast, which is a good sign. It was like, what's this light above my computer? Why is that on? Oh, you're doing a thing. Okay. This isn't just a Zoom call with friends. This is a podcast. All right. Much love to you both. Thank you.
Yeah.